Thank you very much, especially for those poor souls who decided to skip the much nicer environment outside and are eager to listen to the next 30 minutes of my presentation. And I promise you, after Andre actually set the stage this morning, that I will make sure to give you also some positive vibes by the end of the presentation, given the fact that I have one of, let's say, the most frustrating topics to cover, the topic of global geopolitics. There are not really many good news in these topics. But okay, I was given the topic of power shifts, global fragmentation, and the new world order. I can give also 3 hours presentation on this topic, but I will comprise what I want to present in the next 30 minutes. And actually, one of the questions that I'm being asked most often is as follows: what is the world order going to look like? And I have no answer to this question. In fact, nobody can really say how the world order will look like, let's say, in the next year or in the next 5 years. I'm not in the forecasting business. I'm not in the field of predictions. What I do for a living is strategic foresight, where we work with long-term trends, with sometimes 10, 15 years time horizon, where we can identify certain patterns of behavior of large systems. And in my case, this is the global system. So yes, I will try to give you an answer to this question based from the perspective of strategic foresight. And indeed, Christoph, actually, if I'm honest, the most often question I've been asked in the last 9 weeks was the question of the opening, the reopening, the semi-opening, the closure, the semi-closure, the one blockade, the second blockade, or whatever kind of blockade of Strait of Hormuz. And of course, I will talk about this as well. Now, one specific variable that you need to keep in mind when I'm presenting the scenarios is the variable of critical uncertainties. Now, you heard from Andre this morning about one critical certainty. That was the certainty of demographic decline. I do not work with critical certainties. I only operate with the impossible answers. That means with critical uncertainties whose developments we cannot predict. We call this the unknown unknowns. And based on critical uncertainties such as polarization of international relations, or the actors constellation along global and regional power competition, we clearly have certain ideas about pattern of behavior. So I present you the architecture of what I call New Cold War 2.0. Why New Cold War? You will get the answer. But what is important to understand, first and foremost, there are 3 layers of systemic analysis. It's not just geopolitics, as with most of what's happening in the current field of international relations is actually linked to geoeconomics. This is the use of statecraft for the sake of power projection, such is the case with tariffs, such is the case with trade wars, such is the case with also, for example, state subsidies. So we have a plethora of geoeconomic tools. And then we have also the geotechnology. This is, of course, your world, the world of technological innovation, where AI is being regarded already as a game changer for global power competition. This is the mindset on behalf of the front runners. So first important takeaway, the world is not converging. We are not moving towards next globalization phase. In fact, the world is also not fragmenting in the way many are actually discussing it, because we have at the top of the global system something which is a trend that's been ongoing for quite some time now, and it's a trend of the splitting of the global system in two. If you wish, let's use a term from physics. This is some sort of bifurcation of the global system. On the one hand, we have United States. On the other hand, we don't have just China, but we have actually the dragon bear axis. This is a modus operandi of strategic coordination between two powerful players. And what's in between, because it's not just a bifurcating global system, there is a lot of gray zone area, which is opportunistic, which creates a lot of opportunities for businesses, investors, and also state actors, and it's linked to the rise of middle powers. These are countries which operate in different geographic areas, but also operate in different architectures, while navigating these two blocks and trying to avoid an ultimate decision to take a side. And for the moment, for the time being, it works. But as you will see, depending on which scenario will emerge as the most realistic, there might be a period in the future where the intensification of the global power competition will actually reduce the scope of activities of middle powers. Now we know about the architecture. It's a new Cold War for two particular reasons. And I think this is already the first good news I have for you today, because you read certainly a lot about World War III and the new World War, and it's not just the media, it's politicians using these narrations meanwhile. And I am very cautious when I listen to these narrations, because there are two main constraints. One being the possession of nuclear weapons, and second, the realization on behalf of the triumvirate of global power competition, because we are talking only about three concrete countries right now that want to compete with each other, and basically we talk about one particular modus operandi of two countries, being China and Russia on the one hand, and United States on the other, that want to compete on all three terrains, being geopolitics, geoeconomics, and geotechnology. But they do understand that there is a certain threshold that is not allowed to be crossed, and that is the use of nuclear weapons. So the second constraint, linked directly to the first constraint, is no military confrontation at the level of global power competition. United States on the one hand, but also China and Russia on the other, do not have the incentive to get involved in a direct military conflict. Now, we understand there is a threshold that's not supposed to be crossed, and that is because of the mutual assured destruction. But this creates also incentives below the threshold, and the incentives are what we are seeing right now, not only with Iran, not only with Ukraine, not only with Venezuela, and I will explain all the other parts of these puzzle pieces, which are incentives below the threshold, where these very same powers are involved indirectly in proxy wars and military conflicts across all continents, in all relevant domains. Now, that is why New Cold War, or Cold War 2.0. But of course, we want to know more. Let's assume that this is the correct systemic assessment. Now, what we want to know for our business operations or investments is how the world order will look like also in the next 5 to 10 years, because this is a trajectory where we have to locate ourselves, let's say, for a certain period of time. And I have currently 3 realistic scenarios for you. Of course, the optimal scenario will be some sort of hot peace Cold War scenario, where both blocs realize the limitations of their actions and decide that the most optimal outcome would be some sort of coexistence. Of course, much more complex than what we had during the first Cold War. We are in a highly interconnected world with still quite interconnected global economy. So let's assume there is some sort of rationalization on both sides. There are 2 blocs. The conflicts are being frozen. We see ceasefire efforts in Ukraine, in Iran, in most of these hotspots. Of course, there will be military conflicts, but no large conflicts that might actually escalate to the point of reaching a threshold. And of course, this is an uneasy coexistence. But for the current conditions, it's a kind of a acceptable scenario. Some of you would disagree and will say, okay, but we actually have so many more players. The world is so much more complex, And of course, I have to factor in this scenario as well. This is the scenario of volatile multipolarity. Let's assume in the next 5 to 10 years, suddenly there is a new great power emerging on the global arena. That's not unrealistic to expect. For instance, India is en route to becoming world's economy number three in the next 5 years. It might also develop the kind of tools that are needed for global power competition. Then the question, of course, is with whom? Is it going to be China? Because Russia is obviously a strategic partner. Is going to side with one of the two blocs? There are many, many questions to be asked. You might say also, what about Europe? And I will also give you an answer to the question about Europe, why Europe is not on a good trajectory to becoming a geopolitical actor, even though it's still on par with United States and China when it comes to geoeconomic projection in the world. So chaotic multipolarity, actually rather unrealistic, but I put it on the slide so that you feel some kind of vindicated, because you certainly had these thoughts while listening to my presentation. Now, unfortunately, I have also some bad news for you. And one of the bad news is that given the current circumstances in 2026, we moved from hot peace, Cold War, towards the scenario of Cold War 2.0 full escalation. And that means that on the one hand, the decoupling between United States and China, because at the core of this competition, it's about disentanglement and disconnection. The world, as it has been, is never going to be the same. You must create a mindset in anticipation of this transformation. It's a global system transformation, and it's happening under objective conditions, whether we like it or not. But this decoupling is now hardening into direct confrontation, because we saw very clearly that in both proxy wars, in Ukraine and in Iran, there have been very, very clear sides taken by both United States and China. And in fact, one of the reasons why Iran has been able to sustain the US-Israeli effort for now 55 days was the material support coming from China and Russia. When it comes to Ukraine, China is, after 5 years, already openly admitting that it is not in the Chinese interest to see Russia losing the war. So clearly we have now this mutual enforcement of two proxy wars, which I call actually systemic risks on par with what we had during the great financial crisis and what we had during the pandemic. And now we have a new fourth systemic risk-driven crisis with Iran, and that is, of course, bad news for the global system. On top of that, there is another major variable that we need to factor in, and that is the variable of simultaneity. So now we have actually 5 concurrent theaters of conflict. I already mentioned the Operation Epic Fury. I will say a little bit about it later during the presentation. We are in the 5th year of the Russian war against Ukraine. We have a full-fledged gray zone warfare in the South China Sea, around Taiwan, in the Strait of Taiwan, coming from China. And right now, because of this escalation scenario that we have on the top of the global system, there is the widest opportunity window for China also to create certain facts on the ground. And then we have what I call proxy war proliferation. Again, below the threshold, now the opportunism is enabling a lot of volatility, including military conflicts. We saw the revival of Monroe Doctrine 2.0, the extraction operation in Venezuela, the transatlantic rupture over Greenland, and the activation of the Arctic Doctrine, which was actually the doctrine during the First Cold War. And we saw now that there is prioritization on behalf of the United States when it comes to the Western Hemispheric, and also when it comes to the Indo-Pacific domain. So proxy war proliferation is something that actually great powers want to control, but sometimes there are unanticipated consequences, and right now we are in this uncharted water, fully in this uncharted water scenario because of the unanticipated consequences of the second proxy war. And we have a fifth terrain of conflict, which is very much relevant for your, actually for your operation, because now the warfare doesn't have the traditional domains as it was during the First Cold War, but it has an additional one, which is cyber. So next to naval, air, and land operations, they are now also and space, obviously, which was a big issue during the First Cold War. We have now also cyber operations and actually technological innovations that create a game changer and decide wars meanwhile. And this is, of course, a big critical uncertainty because the innovation cycles are currently happening very fast, sometimes after a week or 10 days, and it's very, very hard for political decision makers and for institutional decision makers to catch up with this simultaneity. Now, I mentioned that I want to give you also an answer about Europe becoming a global geopolitical player. Of course, you have to factor in that next to geoeconomics and geotechnology, where Europe, obviously, I don't need to give you this answer, is not a significant player next to the frontrunners, United States and China, but let's just focus on the three impossible trilemmas that will give you an answer about the projection over the next 5 years. And first trilemma is linked to sovereignty, a topic that Andrei covered this morning. So right now the trilemma consists of three different dimensions centered around the transatlantic rupture, that is the gap between United States and Europe, the impossible de-risking strategy towards China, because Europe doesn't want to decouple from China, but at the same time, let's assume the opposite of decoupling, which will be some sort of deepening of the relationship with China. Basically, what Europe will do is to prolong indirectly the war of Russia against Ukraine, because China is also the systemic sustainer of the Russian war effort, which in itself makes absolutely no sense in strategic terms. And then there is this significant push in terms of narration about strategic autonomy, that Europe will develop strategic autonomy, which would be centered around some of the other trilemmas. Now, second trilemma is a dependency transition trilemma, and it's centered about the transition from the old model of the European success, which consisted of cheap, abundant, and affordable energy sources from Russia, market access and production, cheap production from China, and perpetual security and defense and nuclear shield from United States. And this model is now also in transition. And basically now, if you think of the narration about strategic autonomy and combine it with the second trilemma, as of 2026, in fact, Europe is more dependent on all three dimensions from the United States. It's more dependent on energy sources from United States. It's more dependent on access to markets because European companies want to exit Europe for the sake of, for instance, cheaper energy resources. It's more dependent on tech and is also still dependent on security and defense. And then there is the prioritization trilemma, and that means the gap between short, mid, and long-term priorities on the European agenda. We talk about trillions of euro that will be spent over the next 5 to 7 years over three main priorities. One being the reindustrialization of Europe, second being the filling of defense gaps that have been neglected over the last 30 years, and third being the decarbonization. All these three priorities have different timelines, have different needs, and have different financial framework. And of course, again, bringing these three together and deciding which one has to be prioritized is going to be probably the most difficult part for the political and the institutional decision making. Now, I have to make, of course, the remark here that when I say Europe, it's about the European Union, Switzerland has been already covered by Andre, and I think that this is here just it's revealing about the European Union trilemmas, and in that sense, Switzerland is going to be indirectly affected by all these debates and prioritizations. Now, when we speak about AI, as I said, is in the mindset of the two frontrunners, the absolute game changer for global power competition. The mindset on behalf of the United States and China when it comes to AI, and I'm using AI now as a frame, not as a technology, is what they look, when they look at AI, they think of the third industrial revolution, they think of the global power competition between the United States and Soviet Union, and they know that the winner of the third industrial revolution was the winner of the Cold War. And the winner of the Cold War imposed what we like to call the rules-based order, which was the American supremacy in all three terrains. It was the winner imposing its own rules of the game on the world. So when you want to have an answer to the question about the future of the world order, you also have to follow metrics such as technological competition, because right now both China and United States have already started competing through networks, through initiatives. For instance, United States is using Anglosphere Networks, has launched the Pax Silica as an AI initiative that is supposed to include partners and allies along the supply chains, which would be under American control, which will enable access to raw materials that are critically important for the AI revolution. So it's a whole process. Of course, China is doing the same. China has the BRI network of more than 140 countries around the whole globe, and is using the access to cheap raw materials up to the processing. It's actually in control of this production process. It's using scale, it's using speed, it's using state capital, it's using subsidies, it's using war economy. It's a full-fledged competition. Now, again, we may argue, but there are other players. And yes, there are other players. This is not going to be only about US versus China. It's going to be about one system versus another system. And of course, both understand that they need partners and they need allies. And yes, some might say, okay, but right now the United States is not very convincing when it comes to partners. Well, great powers have a different mindset. When convincing doesn't work, coercion will do the job. And this is practically what's happening on both sides. So US-China using their strategic advantages. They have different strategic advantages right now. We are just at the beginning of this competition. Again, critical uncertainty. We don't know the exact outcome of this. But no other nation has actually the full spectrum ecosystem next to the United States and China, when it comes to state capital, when it comes to supply chain debt, when it comes to sovereign AI stock. And yes, of course, both will also try to engage with third countries, and we'll try, as we saw, for instance, with the United States when it comes to the cooperation with the Taiwanese TSMC, but also when it comes to China and use of the so-called BRI mineral corridor, or when it comes to the Dragon Bear energy network, where China, even now in times of crisis, can rely on much cheaper energy resources from Moscow. Okay, and this, of course, I try to somehow come up with some sort of foresight for the industry, because yes, okay, we understand this outlook, but what does it mean explicitly? And first, the immediate consequence of these realities and these global transformation processes, as well as megatrends, is that digital sovereignty is turning into a geopolitical variable. So we might discuss that we are able to operate in alternative architectures, but in reality, this infrastructure is no longer neutral and is going to become a strategic asset in a bifurcating world. So even if we do not want it to be part of these conversations and processes, it is inevitable to happen at some point of time in the future that both competing blocks will consider digital sovereignty as strategic asset. Then, of course, second important consequence is that supply chain risk is becoming your risk. And that means that, and we saw it already with the Hormuz cascade, that physical choke points and physical world is directly impacting, especially amid global power competition, is directly impacting the digital infrastructure. Whether it's about the data centers, as right now we saw, for instance, in the Gulf region, data centers were closed because of lack of energy. Mining rigs need electricity, chip fabrication needs rare earths. You get the idea. So physical and digital world are actually intertwined. And then, of course, the next consequence is that the new world order will be built on AI and crypto rails. So it's inevitable also to weaponize the digital world for the sake of global power competition. And that means also that the rules of the global system, which are currently being written by those who are trying to control the full system of AI computing, energy access, financial infrastructure, state subsidies, that this is going to be also part of the bigger equation. Now, what does it mean concretely, knowing all this information, taking into account the megatrend, the most realistic scenarios for the next 5 years? How can we work with that? And this is a direct translation for you, direct conversion from the strategic foresight and scenario planning work into real world. And I put foresight that I did already in December. And of course, I wanted to put it the same way so that you can see actually whether it stands the test of time. Now, first important takeaway for you, and I think this is the most optimistic takeaway. Again, no World War III. It's very important. The risk of such is real, but this has been the case also during the First Cold War. I mean, the risk of the use of nuclear weapons, the risk of miscalculation. There is a risk, but the risk is as low as it was prior to the intensification of the current phase of global affairs. So no hot war between US, China, and Russia. Cold War logic kicks in, and that means that great powers stick to the mindset of mutual assured destruction. However, the intensification of the proxy wars creates an additional layer of insecurity. Second important takeaway, no Taiwan invasion. Even with this larger window of opportunity for China, and consider also the military purge that happened in China, even under these circumstances, there is little readiness on behalf of the Chinese leadership to actually start this kind of risky operation in terms of military attack on Taiwan. However, still there is a sweeping, ongoing gray zone warfare on behalf of China towards Taiwan, which is a death by thousand cuts approach towards the political system, the vibrant economic model, as well as the penetration of the society. It's the current base scenario. Then what is, as you can see, has been revised. That means that it has been adapted based on the new variables, is this window of opportunity for ceasefire in Ukraine and some sort of peace without peace treaty between Russia and Ukraine. So basically 2026, even with this high intensity of war that's happening right now, is actually opening a window of opportunity for peace. There are different variables that play a role here. I don't have the time to explain it, but certainly even this mutual enforcement of the two systemic risks is actually not helping the Russian economy for the moment. There are structural issues. Yes, so expect probably by the end of spring, maybe summertime, depending also on the continuation of the other war, that there might be finally a breakthrough in the 5th year of this war. Proxy war proliferation, I already explained this. What it means, expect also a lot of hotspots happening along the Western Hemisphere. We saw with Panama Canal maybe the activation of the operation against Cuba. Venezuela is still ongoing, and there will be other puzzle pieces happening there up to the Arctic. The Greenland issue is also not over. This is very much on the agenda, and do not think that the Chinese-Russian influence has decreased just because of the American operations. Proxy war proliferation is basically the leitmotif, if you wish, for this transitionary period. Now, I think the best, second best news next to no World War III is basically the managed rivalry phase. What I am expecting to happen this year is out of strategic necessity, not so much out of conviction, is that the triumvirate of great power will have to come to terms about the rules of engagement. Remember when during the First Cold War there was this dialogue on, for instance, trust building measures to prevent nuclear exchange or to prevent miscalculation? This is going to happen this year. Maybe with the first summit between the United States and China, maybe even earlier, because China will have somehow, at some point of time, have to step in and provide security guarantees for Iran. Otherwise, Iran will not agree on any ceasefire with the United States. So you clearly see how these things are interconnected. And again, managed confrontation is actually a good thing. It's good news for international business operations and for investors, international investors, because it creates at least some kind of predictability in this ocean of volatility and uncertainty. And last but not least, as I said, AI in my world, in the world of geopolitics and geoeconomics, is considered the absolute game changer. Just keep in mind that these two front runners will never lose sight of this. Now, some final words about the global system rupture, because the ongoing war right now in the 9th week in Iran has unleashed two unanticipated consequences. They haven't been factored in, nobody wanted them to happen, yet this is the reality of war. It never happens according to the plan, and the two unanticipated consequences were, one, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. In my world, this is the worst of scenario. This is the stuff nightmares are made of, so to say, for geopolitical strategists. But to make it even worse, the destruction of energy infrastructure, the creation of a scenario of physical scarcity, of real physical scarcity, of unimaginable proportions. This is now a new situation that's happening in parallel to the military intervention, to the naval blockade, to the land operation that's being planned on behalf of the United States. So this is a different story. This is a story that affects the whole world. And this is a story that is now creating allocation crisis that has multiplicative cascading effects on global economy, on global commodities markets, on global trade. I just put some of the multiplicative effects for you to show you how systemic this has been from first week. Now we are in week 9. As you know, politicians are slow in realizing these effects. So that means that we are already far too late to act against it. And of course, global system rupture represents the tipping point of no return. We are not there yet, but we might enter this uncharted water scenario where basically the tipping point will accelerate the bifurcation, will accelerate all of this kind of strategic assessment that I gave you. And that means, of course, now again directly translated, short term, that this multiplicative cascade will also create fiscal burden on governments, will create inflationary impact, will create global recession scenario for probably the next 6 to 12 months, will create even stagnation scenario for European Union economies. Of course, in this kind of environment, it will be much more difficult to act and to navigate. So, the final equation. From my perspective, there is, the question is not whether a new world order will emerge. It's already emerging. You have to decide with which kind of scenario you want to operate, whether this is relevant for your activities or not. The next step is, of course, also to make a conscious decision in which kind of architecture you want to operate. You can operate in both parallel architectures. It's up to you, of course, but you have to be mindful of the risks. Yes, there will be also opportunities, but you have to be mindful of the risks. And the equation goes from AI supremacy, so meaning that once we know who is going to win the AI revolution, we will know also who is going to win the fourth industrial revolution, and by extension, this will give us an idea about the future of the world order, whether we will end up with Pax Americana 2.0 or we will end up with Dragon Bear 1.0. It's open for everyone to decide, and it's open for everyone to follow, but these are relevant developments that will, of course, decide not just the future of the world order, it will decide also our decision making, short, mid, long term. And in that sense, I thank you for the attention.
Thank you. Velina, please stay. Because I think, I don't know if anyone has any questions. Take any questions, or everyone is ready for stagflation coming?
Yes, there is a question.
Question where?
Thank you, first of all, so much for your presentation. Is there a scenario, a third scenario, in what you assumed, in which geography, nations, and the control and the power of AI are not coupled? So in other words, is there, and I'm not necessarily a small country, winning the AI race, which is a possibility, but is there, does it have to be tied to geopolitics, the supremacy of AI? Will it, or can it be, is there a scenario where nationalities don't play a role in the supremacy driven by AI?
No. Because you have 4 or 5 metrics that are all linked to actually state actor behavior. If you consider speed of change, if you consider scope, if you consider scale, the scalability, if you consider sovereignty issues, that even if you are very successful and not bound to a state actor, that there might be a state actor that can just interfere or can exercise military operation against you or can do an extract operation. And then, of course, there is also the case of state capital. Even if we joke that China is the state capitalism model, but meanwhile, actually, the United States is turning into the mindset of war economy. A war economy means partially also state capitalism, because when it comes to critical infrastructure, critical investments, critical supply chains, and so on and so forth, you basically end up with some sort of mindset of state capitalism, which is the state deciding over the market dynamics, over the free markets. And in that sense, I just don't see how you can operate. Even if you take the example of a state actor deciding to just switch off the internet. Iran didn't have internet for 55 days now. So how are you going to operate in a digital world where a state actor can actually interfere at any time and basically either push you away or intervene or introduce a ban or basically switch you off? Even the undersea cables, because the topic is so complex and they're so important for the digital infrastructure, It's not just the satellites. The satellites are also, meanwhile, a target, potential target. But the undersea cables, we have witnessed already clear cases of sabotage linked to state actor behavior. So how are you going to make sure that you have actually the required independence of operations?
That's why you need AccuRest, yeah, and then you're independent, yeah. So, just coming back. Any more questions?
Hi, thank you very much. You mentioned before in the presentation that blockchains are not neutral. Could you touch on that just a moment?
Yes. So basically, if you think that blockchain is, for instance, only part of the conversations at such amazing conferences as this one, you are absolutely wrong. Governments are having the same discussions, it's just that these are closed-door discussions. So what happens at some point of time in the future if a government decides that blockchain belongs to my critical infrastructure? It's part of the way how I enable full-fledged architecture of operations. So in that sense, it can happen at any point of time. There is also a possibility that it doesn't happen, depending on, again, decision-making, depending on perceptions, depending on systems analysis, depending on decision which technologies will be critically important for me as a state actor, which is part of a bigger, let's say, coalition or alliance of state actors. And these are conversations that need to be, you see, I will give you another example. Just 15 years ago, economic experts, trade experts, and people like me from the field of security and defense, we were operating in different realities. We had no points of intersection. Right now, we are sitting together at the same table because of the intersection between geopolitics and geoeconomics. Economic policy is security policy. Industrial policy is security policy. Same will happen with technology. Those technologies that are considered security policy are going to be instrumentalized by state behavior.
I think we have one question in the back here.
So I took a look at this sort of roadmap in terms of escalation. You see increased spikes in energy all the way to system meltdown. And I was asking myself if you have come or identify any strategy for that essentially makes it so expensive to go through this multi-step that is just counterintuitive, that could be somehow, injected in the current system. This is the first. And the second one is, what does it mean to a sovereign individual with mobility that can just, relocate or so? What is the best strategy for someone to, I guess, adapt towards such a hostile setup?
Yes. Could you be more precise on the first question, because I couldn't
yes.
Give me a
is there some sort of a
what you
strategy or sort of a game theory approach towards making it more expensive the further you go into this escalation of the roadmap from energy spikes all the way to nuclear and system meltdown, that you have thought that maybe is in discussion across governments, just for me to understand? And yeah.
You mean discussions on behalf of governments to prevent
yes,
calculation?
Of course, yes.
Yes, of course. But right now we are also in the situation where we have a tremendous technological revolution. Just to give you one example, there are, for instance, already discussions in governments, in state governments, how, for instance, AI might get an access to the use of nuclear weapons, and that there has to be a very specific state control imposed on the use of nuclear weapons. This is, by the way, now becoming part of military doctrines. So what is not happening yet, so we already saw the manifestation of the first phase, which is military to military, direct military to military
yes.
communication. That's good. sign. It happened already also prior to this Trump 2.0 administration, but now what needs to happen is comprehensive process that entails all chains of decision making to ensure that any situation that might lead to miscalculation, including the use of nuclear weapons, is avoided. And this is not happening yet. This is why I meant that this kind of managed confrontation scenario is about to happen now, because this is the most rational thing to expect, given the intensification of war, and also given the risks linked to this intensification. So I expect this to happen already in 2026.
I see.
And I'll be looking at bilateral US-China steps, but also trilateral US-China, Russia. I think that the Americans want actually to bring both. I mean, China is still reluctant because China wants to catch up in the nuclear, in the military domain. And it doesn't have the incentive right now to sit at a table with the Americans, but I argue that this is going to change.
And on a private level, self-sovereign, I mean, is the solution just run or what?
Yes, there are solutions. And basically, when I say gray zone of warfare, aside of the triumvirate of the three powers, right now, nobody, almost nobody, on behalf of middle powers or on behalf of what is called Global South, which is the rest of the world, wants to be part, and we will have an amazing keynote speaker immediately after me, and he will be talking about this, wants to be part of this bifurcation, wants to be part of this global power competition, wants to take sides, wants to go only with the one option. And this is, I think, the optionality now for actually for sovereignty-loving individuals and businesses, because there are many opportunities around the world. I wouldn't point to a specific continent, but there are these so-called hubs. I would be looking, for instance, if I want to locate in a country, I will be looking whether this country is already successfully managing this navigation, what kind of hedge strategy this country is pursuing. Some countries are more successful because of fate of geography, or access to a critical technology, or access to certain raw materials. Again, we will hear about this, for instance, when it comes to Latin America. But other countries are just lucky to be positioned along a critically important supply chain or maritime or commerce corridor. I wouldn't look at scale or size particularly. I would look at this kind of behavior on behalf of a country, and it is actually open to every continent. I wouldn't exclude any continent right now.
Okay, we have one last question before we close down.
Thank you. Excellent presentation, first of all. I would like to invite you, if you can address us further on the topic of blockchain in the context of the definition of what an economy is. Because territorially speaking, we can look at the economies as national economies, but we can look also at the different other factors that are expanding an economy, like for instance when we are looking at petrodollar. So how about the crypto dollar or other type of currencies, the role of stable coins in this context, and the geography that changes in terms of the influence of a specific nation through its currency in the world of crypto. Thank you.
Yes. So I will present you the current trend that's happening again at the top of the global system. What's happening right now? There are two competing models and approaches. If we take the, let's say, the Dragon Bear approach, there is, on the one hand, state policy, deliberate state policy to introduce central bank digital currencies on both sides, on the Russian and Chinese side. But then again, there is a coordinated third approach when it comes to the relations with third countries. And this approach actually is in both worlds, in the physical and in the crypto world, because what they want is not to introduce a new global reserve currency. They cannot do it. But what they are doing right now is to create a shadow financial and monetary system. One that is not based on the principles of the functioning Western dominated or US dominated financial systems. This system is supposed to enable the transaction between these countries and third countries in their national currencies. So here I see a big role also for crypto, because they will use all means at their disposal to facilitate these payments. What they want is actually the increased share of payments in national currencies. So it's, I would say, not specifically centered, it's not an approach centered around one specific strategy. It's entailing different strategies. They are testing things out. And I wouldn't exclude also the use of blockchain and other technologies. But again, the mindset here is I need to be in control of the process. And second important point is, why are they doing it? Well, they are doing it because they want to bypass. They want to bypass sanctions regimes. They want to bypass, you know, the dollar-based system. On the other hand, US, and this is when I spoke about transatlantic rupture, this is a big issue right now, because there is a big rupture between the European Union decision makers and United States. United States want to preserve the the US dollar as a global reserve currency based on the use of stable coins. They understand that the only way to prolong the life of the currency status is via new technologies, while the European Union is sticking to a traditional approach, which is to enable the European Central Bank to introduce digital euro, which basically, if you compare it now, and I'm just comparing the trend, you will make your own conclusions, is basically being on par with China and Russia. It's basically doing what China and Russia are doing. I don't know which one of the two approaches will be the most successful one. We are just at the beginning of the trend, but I see on both sides actually a large, large opportunities, a window of opportunity for the new technologies.
Thank you.
Thank you.